Mike, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you for taking the time to join us on Conversations with Coopman. It's Andrew and Will here.
Great to have you on the podcast. How are you?
Hi, good to see you. I'm well, thanks.
Good stuff, good stuff. Well, look, we're covering a very important topic today, Mike, and one that's obviously going to be very prevalent in the months ahead, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD for short. I've given the listeners a bit of an introduction into yourself and the consultancy business that you ultimately run. And obviously one part of IG Services is to work with pension funds, and a key area of focus for you is this upcoming TCFD regulation. As a starting point, it'd be great if you could give us a brief introduction into the work that you do and why this is coming into effect.
Yeah, no, thanks, Andrew. I'm delighted to be able to join your podcast series. And yeah, climate change is one of the aspects that I look at. I look at all aspects of investment governance for pension funds. But right now, climate change really is the issue of our times. We've all seen the headlines. We've seen the wildfires in Australia, California. We've seen flooding in our own countries, and we've had things like locust swarms in East Africa. More than ever now, though, climate change is seen not just as an environmental issue, but it's also a financial or an economic problem. And left unchecked, climate change is going to cause unprecedented financial strains. So whether that's migration due to water shortages or perhaps even parts of the world becoming almost unsurvivable, we're going to see change on an unprecedented scale. And I guess some people might be thinking, well, where do pension funds fit into this? Why are they part of the solution? And I think it's because at a basic level, pension funds own a huge amount of capital. So the OECD estimates that pension funds globally own $50 trillion of capital. And that is a huge amount of responsibility when they're deciding how to allocate that capital. And the TCFD disclosures are one part of that story. So TCFD is the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, which was created in 2015, and it published its recommendations in 2017. And the aim of the recommendations is to promote better informed decision-making, and it's based on transparency and disclosure. So the idea is that if you've got the information, then investors can allocate capital more efficiently. And it applies to everybody that's involved in the investment chain. So that's from the asset owners like pension funds right at the top of the chain through to asset managers and ultimately to the underlying investee companies. And I work in all aspects of investment governance for pension funds. And what I'm seeing is that climate change is increasingly coming to the top of the agenda. And I've worked with a number of pension funds that are adopting the disclosures voluntarily. But what's happening from next year is that for many pension funds, the disclosures are going to become compulsory. And that means it's going to get a huge amount of attention, not least because the UK government is hosting COP26 in Glasgow later this year. So it's really at the top of everyone's agenda.
Right. That's brilliant, Mike. Thank you for that. And you mentioned a lot there on TCFD, and I guess that's been sort of one part of the story in terms of the kind of climate related disclosure recommendations to be able to make that kind of informed decisions and have clear transparency. I mean, what do you feel that the pension fund or the asset managers, I guess, need to do to plan ahead of what challenges that they're going to face?
Well, I think some pension funds are on top of this already, but I think there's also a lot of pension funds out there that are going to have to do a lot of work in a very short space of time. So the disclosures themselves are structured around four themes. There's the way that pension funds are governed, their strategy, their risk management, and metrics and targets. So under the governance theme, there are lots of questions to be answered. So, for example, do pension funds have climate change objectives written into their terms of reference? What's the level of knowledge of climate risk around the board? And how are their advisors and asset managers held to account? All that needs to be documented and understood. Secondly, the strategy theme is particularly demanding. It requires an articulation of what the risks are over the short, medium, and long term. And crucially, there's going to be a new requirement now to publish scenarios. So pension funds are going to be required to work out what happens in different climate outcomes. So that might be looking at, well, what happens if there is a fast transition? What happens if there's a slow transition? What happens if there is no transition? And that might get split into, well, what are the physical risks to assets being destroyed by physical events like those floods or the wildfires? And what are the transition risk exposures? And all of that is critical to the proper financial management of a pension fund. The third theme, the risk management stream, will have a tremendous knock-on impact to asset managers. What pension funds want to know is how asset managers identify and address climate risk and opportunity. And that's in every asset class and every fund. So it's not just the specialist climate funds. And they'll expect the climate risk and opportunity to be fully integrated into asset managers' processes. And my experience is that there's some managers that are out there that are really a long way ahead on that trajectory. Others aren't quite so far ahead. And what I'm seeing is that managing climate risk and opportunity effectively in all asset classes is becoming a source of competitive advantage or indeed disadvantage for asset managers. And then finally, the metrics and targets is a very challenging area. What is going to be required as a minimum is the publication of the current greenhouse gas emissions associated with each pension fund's asset portfolio. Now, that's a big step forward, but all it gives is a snapshot in time. And what pension funds really need to know is, well, what's their climate trajectory? So they might ask their asset managers or their advisors, is our portfolio consistent with the Paris Agreement? So is it consistent with a 2-degree or less warming? And much of that challenge around getting the data will be pushed from the pension funds to the asset managers and their advisors. So the leaders in this area will have set themselves up to be able to answer those questions for pension funds. They will provide the scenarios. They'll work out the implied temperature change. And not only that, it won't be a passive activity. They'll also be working on the stewardship side, the voting and the engagement side of their businesses to make sure that they're pushing their underlying companies to do the right things, to publish their climate trajectories and to manage their climate risk.
That's great. Thanks, Mike. And I know you mentioned quite a lot there around themed strategies, and I guess it's going to be particularly demanding for a lot of fund managers over the next, the short to medium to long term, which is critical to their financial management and I guess overall their kind of reputation as an asset manager and a pension fund. Do you feel that this is going to be a kind of tick box exercise for the asset manager, and what happens if the funds, they don't get on board at all?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I think it can't be allowed to be a tick box exercise. We're heading into possibly one of the biggest economic transitions that the world's ever seen. I think that COVID will be seen as a drop in the ocean in comparison to the extent to which economies will need to change. It's going to pervade every aspect of our life, whether it's electrification of cars and transport, energy generation, infrastructure like battery storage, construction, new technologies, carbon capture. There's an endless list, and there's pretty much no area of economic activity that's untouched. I mean, even cyber, Bitcoin, for example, Bitcoin transactions are very, very carbon intensive due to the amount of computer power that's needed to process them. So in essence, there's a lot of risks and a huge amount of opportunity as the capital is redeployed. It seems to me that ticking boxes is unlikely to be the way that we'll do this well. The nature of the problem seems to be more like thinking outside the box. We need outside of the box thinking and solutions for this problem. Now, I think what we're seeing is, yes, pension funds will be forced by legislation to get on board, But what that then means is that they'll look to their asset managers and their advisors. And frankly, if asset managers and advisors don't get on board, they'll start to see the client losses. I've already seen in my experience, pension funds choose asset managers that have strong climate credentials over and above the other managers. And I think that trend will only continue.
I guess from a kind of the risk to the pension fund there, Mike, and is huge. If they don't get on board, and I guess the tick box exercise is probably not the way that they're going to view this. But I guess from your perspective, what sort of timeline would you anticipate before firms do start to lose clients as a result of not getting on board?
Well, some of these disclosures have to be in place for some pension funds next year. So we're talking quite a short timeline. It always takes a little bit longer for that to follow through to the way that advisors are chosen and asset managers are chosen. But I would say this is such a rapidly developing area and fast-moving area. It will not be long until advisors are chosen or deselected on the basis of their credibility in this area, and absolutely the same for asset managers. We're talking a matter of measured in months and years, not in decades, for this change to happen.
And do you think a lot of opportunity will be given before assets are withdrawn, Mike? If we look at kind of engaging at board level and AGMs, do you think the pension funds will provide opportunities for the discussions to happen before they ultimately pull their assets or move away or select someone else? Or do you think it will be fairly decisive in that if they're not on board, they're moving on?
Yeah, I think it will vary from pension fund to pension fund. So there may be one approach might be that a pension fund is thinking of changing its manager in any case, and therefore right at the top of the agenda, I think you'll find climate risk will be there and used as a measure to find out who the next manager should be. I also think that the current legislation will force or encourage a wholesale review. So we will see changes in the choice of managers, and we'll see changes in the approach that trustee boards use to select their managers.
And in terms of then this kind of regulation, and we've got others coming down the track not long after this as well, is there a chance, as with other areas of financial services, that there could be almost death by regulation? Or would you feel that we're starting to come towards a balanced point between kind of transparency and reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very conscious that it's true. There's always a huge amount of legislation and regulation or reviews that are directed at pension funds. And yeah, sometimes that can be quite overwhelming. I'm certainly aware that the Pensions Act 2021 is going to impose yet more legislation on pension funds. That said, though, I think really all the legislation does is impose or sets minimum governance standards on pension funds. In the case of TCFD in particular, though, I'm conscious that some trustees may feel that either it's not their role or that they're powerless to act or just don't know where to start. But I do think things have moved on a lot, though, over the last few years. Climate change is very clearly a financial and economic risk, and there is plenty of opportunity and expertise out there. What I would say is that pension funds could look to other pension funds to see what they're already doing well. So, for example, the Church of England pension fund is a relatively small fund, but it punches well above its weight in climate change, and it does that by resourcing its team effectively. The Brunel pension fund, which is one of the local authority super funds, has got a very well developed climate policy, as do a number of the big DC master trusts. There's a lot of knowledge out there. A lot of it's publicly available. And there are industry groups that pension funds can join, such as the Transition Pathway Initiative, the Paris Alignment Forum. So I think the balance is about right. this is one of the most critical areas to get right. It really is worth putting the resources behind it.
Yeah, and you used the Church of England as a good example of I guess being able to resource a team effectively there, Mike, and I guess from my perspective, speaking to leaders and experts across the industry, and as you said that with the increase in regulations and legislations coupled with a demanding regulatory schedule is overwhelming for many teams and funds, and I guess tying this back into a resourcing perspective, then there is always a tendency, I guess, to kind of move towards more of or engage a kind of consulting when teams do become stretched and overwhelmed to support them as a business. Moving forward, what do pension funds, in your opinion, need to be doing and need to consider from a resourcing perspective?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. For some pension funds, undoubtedly, the TCFD disclosures will be a bit of a wake-up call. It'll no longer be good enough for them to say that they delegate management of climate risk to their asset managers. Instead, they'll be required to set a strategy, set it in detail, and demonstrate how they hold their asset managers to account and the governance that they set around that. So that's quite transformative. And you're right. Traditionally, some pension funds do default to using their normal consultants for advice. And I suspect we'll see a slightly different behavior for climate change. Firstly, because the consultants themselves are building resources in this area as quickly as they can, but they're competing with asset managers and pension funds for the right expertise, which is quite scarce. And what that means is that the knowledge is more dispersed than normal. So it makes more sense to look a bit more widely. I guess the second aspect is this really isn't a set and forget project. For some funds, this may be a catalyst to permanently change their board and executive governance structure. Some funds may decide they need new roles within their teams to address climate risk, either long-term or as a special project. So this will become a challenge of resourcing and finding the right level of expertise at the right time. So I think this means more than asking the usual advisor to write a paper on climate change. It goes to the heart of the way that a pension fund is governed. It's a complicated, nebulous, multi-year problem. And frankly, if there's a quick fix to it, we'd have done it by now. So in essence, I think the government is right to focus on this. We've seen how climate change is a significant financial risk and a huge opportunity. And what getting it right does is it makes pension fund beneficiaries more secure and better off.
And in terms of getting the right talent in place, meeting these disclosures, providing that transparency, is there a concern that ultimately fund managers and asset managers will increase their fees to reflect the additional work that's required in order to meet this regulation and to meet their sustainability targets?
That's a good question. I think that there's a tremendous downward pressure on fees in the industry in general. So whether that's the extent to which that competes with the pressure to do more work remains to be seen. My sense is that actually the bang for your buck that you can get by employing a team to do this type of work is completely outweighs any small incremental cost. So it's, to my mind, any tiny incremental cost is going to be completely outweighed by the better investment returns, the better outcomes that we'll see as a result of managing the risks better and capturing the opportunities that come up.
Interesting. Good point that you made there, Mike. And I suppose in kind of summary then, because obviously you're engaged in this on a regular basis, if we were to kind of conclude, or if you were to go out to a client or a pension fund and you were to advise them in kind of being ready for this regulation, I suppose to summarize, what would be the 3 key things that you would kind of get them to pay attention to straight away?
I think top of the list is start right now. It might sound like there's a lot of time to put this in place, but actually there's a lot of changes that might be required at board level and at strategy level. So that's point one. Point two is start thinking about those climate scenarios early as well. There's a lot of information out there on climate scenarios. Some of it is relevant to pension funds, some less relevant. So there's quite a bit to do to sift through that. And then finally, focusing on the risk metrics and the targets. That is quite a complicated process of pulling together a lot of data from different sources and aggregating it. So there's a lot of work there. But more importantly than that, those risk metrics and targets are then going to define how you manage climate risk going forwards for the next 10 years or so. So making sure those targets are set in a sensible way, in a way that you can influence, is critical and needs a substantial amount of time and thought to be applied to it.
That's brilliant there. Thanks, Mike, for such an insightful summary there, and I'm sure our audience would be some key takeaways in terms of your experience and knowledge. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you both very much. It's very, very good to meet you and to be able to participate.
Brilliant. And I'm sure, Mike, if anybody has any questions around this particular regulation, you're more than happy for them to reach out to yourself and IG Services to learn more.
Yes, I can be contacted on the website, which is www.igservices.co.uk.
Perfect. Well, look, again, very much appreciate your time and your insights into this particular topic. It's been a pleasure to speak to you, Mike, and we wish you all the best for the remainder of the year.
Thank you. You too.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Conversations with Coopman. If you are looking to hire excellent talent or considering your next career move in front office, risk, compliance, or accounting, please reach out to a member of our specialist recruitment team. If you have any questions about the financial services market, feel free to leave a comment below and we will get back to you soon. And if you like this podcast episode, we'd greatly appreciate a video like, or even better, subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with our latest releases.